What's space work today? In the old days, they mainly took crew who were test pilots. They were really the heroes. Roughly 40% of them died during their test piloting. Nobody knows much about that. So they were, those are the first astronauts. Nowadays, that's not the case. Some of the so-called soft characteristics are being seen as much more important, because you have a group up there, and the group has to function together, and you have the team on the Earth of a few hundred people operating the system, and they all have to be able to work together, and they have to get along together. And the psychological aspect of working together and getting along together is extremely important. So you have all these diverse agencies, diverse departments, research teams. On our Spacelab 1 mission, we had 100 different research teams, all working simultaneously with poor crew. So you can imagine, you are starting an experiment, and it's supposed to take 45 minutes to complete, and after 45 minutes you've only set it up because it's taken longer. The next experimenter on the ground says, well, it's my time to get the crew time, because this crew time costs 10,000 pounds a minute or whatever it is. And you have problems if you don't work very well. So you have a lot of stress. You have multicultural. Now on the station, you have a Russian and 2 Americans, or an American and 2 Russians, or American meaning could be also the European crew who tags along with the Americans. Sometimes some other countries, Japanese and Canadians are involved. So you have a number of stressors, that's what we call them, like this timeline. You have symptoms. As a medical doctor, you know what those are. Sometimes it's too late when you see a symptom. Sometimes it's early enough to take action. And then you have the consequences of some bad psychological state if you've not taken quick enough or prophylactic action, action in advance to prevent something taking place. If you recognize a symptom early enough, you might be able to take corrective action in time. You have various types of stressors. I'm now going into the space psychology specific. Later I'm going to go into the normal group dynamics which affect everybody. These are the stressors that the crew feel experience in space, and this is partly because it's a space psychology course. We will go through these things first. You have the unique stressors of the space environment. I'll talk about those, the habitat, the mission operations, communications, the psychosocial stressors, both between you and your fellow crew and the ground, and talking about the ground space communications. The space environment, you are weightless. This can be a problem. When we were setting up our neurophysiological experiment, we practiced it on the ground very often with the crew. How to stick the electrodes to get the nystagmus, 2 electrodes, one above and below, another 2 left and right of the eye, etc. And we tested everything, all the signals, and we realized it takes 15 minutes to set up. Good. And then we can take measurements for 30 minutes. The experiment is 45 minutes, and then we can hand over the crew to the next experimenter. Because it was very tightly, plus or minus 1 minute, the crew time. And at ISS, it's a bit more tolerant time, but on a week's mission, it was very stressful. And the crew took 45 minutes to set up, so we had a problem. So things take longer. Your perceptual motor skills also are a little bit impaired. You have more complex performance. You don't move and act the way you do on the Earth. Everything is a bit more difficult. The first crew who go up there when you film them, they're usually trying to do the Superman thing, or Batman or whatever, flying this way. It doesn't really, it's not very successful. The idea is you hold on to one of those bars next to the racks, and you give it a push, and then you move sideways along the racks, and then you stop yourself when you get to the right rack. So it's totally different than what you see in Superman. And they have to learn all this when they go up there. So you have fewer environmental cues, whereas up and down. You could have your racks and your experiments on the floor. Well, they try to create an atmosphere that looks like 1G being the bottom, but it's not quite true. You can work upside down. You learn to read upside down after a while. because you could be in any orientation when you're looking at your experiment. You have the dark and light cycle, which is totally wrong. You have some windows going outside, but it's every 90 minutes you have your first day and night very quickly. And you have, last but not least, the so-called space adaptation syndrome. This is a polite way of saying getting sick, like being seasick, vomiting. It's just a polite expression. And roughly 50% of crew suffer from this. I have been involved in parabolic flight, where we try to experience a little bit of weightlessness to test our experiments. And I can assure you, many of us get very sick, and I got extremely sick. And it was so bad, I was having feelings like I wished I hadn't been born, I wished I hadn't gone into another. It was just terrible, terrible. When you are vomiting, and you are being still stimulated to continue, and this carries on for a couple of hours. You don't just get off your joyride in the Luna Park or whatever, you have to stay on board. And it can be an awful experience once you start getting sick and you can't stop it. Sometimes I don't, but some people don't get sick at all. And they do get sick in space. Fortunately, they adapt. After 2 or 3 days, they adapt. So the first couple of days can be very difficult. And on a 6-month mission, then it's not a problem. On a short mission, it can be. Let's carry on. We have other constraints: sleeping, eating, exercising. You have to do special exercise to keep in shape. You have a lack of privacy. Going to the toilet, defecating, urinating. All of these are real problems. It's not so simple. I remember once a colleague telling me they got some awful results on their experiment. It was some experiment that tested certain gases in the laboratory facility they had on board. And they were getting signals that they had never got on the Earth. And they debated what it could be, until one of them had a bright idea. And they tested it. Yes. One of them is smiling, yes. Somebody had farted on board. They had to test it on the ground by somebody farting into a plastic bag and then putting into the equipment and testing it. But that's what we did on the ground. And then finally they realized what it was all about. So the equipment was not failing, but this was the kind of thing. You fart on board and everybody knows about it. And you have a few hundred people on the ground debating the matter. You have very little privacy. One crewman was telling me, just maybe I'll entertain you with some little anecdotes, because a lot of this you'll forget otherwise. He was on the Mir station, and he was waiting for his fellow crew. Said he was going to go to the toilet, and he had to relieve himself, and he was going to be back in 10 minutes, and they would do their experiment. Well, after about 45 minutes, he decided to go and investigate what was going on. The Mir station was larger than the space shuttle, but not as large as the ISS, so he had a little way to go. And he went there, and he saw his crew member with a bag in his hand, flying around with another kind of a net catcher and trying to catch things in the air, and asked him what he was doing. Well, he had not quite followed the procedure. Now, you're a medical student, so I'll tell you, because everybody doesn't talk about things like toiletry on the space station. They usually talk about fascinating, looking at the stars, and but the crew also defecate and urinate just as we do. And the way the Russian toilet worked was, the procedure was, you sit on you have a certain orifice of some sorts. You put a bag into it, like some kind of a plastic or whatever, and you have a suction pulling through it. It's not a plastic bag, but it's usually some kind of a paperish bag that allows air through it, so the suction can suck through it. So when you defecate, it holds the material to the bottom of the bag. And the procedure says, first, you don't defecate and urinate in the same orifice. One you use for one purpose, and another orifice you use for different purposes. It's a bit more complicated for women, but that's one of the minor problems in space. But we have done a lot of parabolic flight tests with women urinating on the special type of containers. It's all the real problems of spaceflight. One doesn't talk about these things, but these are the less romantic aspects. And anyway, he turned, the procedure said, first put the bag in, turn on the fan, defecate, close the bag, and turn off the fan. And there's a special procedure printed there. Well, he had done it so often, he didn't bother reading the procedure. So he turned on the fan as he should, and he defecated, and he turned off the fan. Oh, did it the wrong way around. He should have closed the bag first. By the time he was about to close the bag, everything had flown out. And it was flying everywhere, and they have all kinds of air circulation on the station, pulling everything everywhere else, and going into the vents and between the racks and everything else. So he had to, as quickly as possible, try to perform a rescue operation to try to get all those feces before they start blocking everything up. That's real life in space. That's the romantic astronautics, the life of an astronaut. Of course, you are a little bit concerned about, you have a certain amount of fear. No astronaut will tell you that he's not afraid, he's afraid, but there is that. When the STS-107 was damaged with some ice on one of the wings, they couldn't do anything about it. And that was enough to cause the vehicle to burn up on its way down. So it's a very delicate operation. It's not so simple. Although very few crew get killed, it costs a hell of a lot of money to try and keep them safe. Because it politically doesn't look good if they die. And it's also not very nice. If you're going to go to Mars, that's really something. Imagine looking back at the Earth, not from the moon and seeing a beautiful Earth, but seeing the Earth shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until it becomes a point, like a star in the sky. And then realizing you may never go back to mankind again. Nobody knows exactly how we're going to react to this psychological stress. It's a new thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's an awful thing. What will it be? How will we react to it? Being separated from our loved ones. And this, being separated from the loved ones, when I talked to a lot of the crew who had been on the space station and on the Mir station for a long period of time, the longest was 430 days, and I asked them what was their main stress. They said they forgot about the safety after a while, but what they didn't forget about was their loved ones. And that was one of their greatest stress, being so separated. And if ever they talked to their family, which they were promised that they would have private lines, they were never private. They were guaranteed the right to talk with their partners, like a man talking with his wife, but they were told they were not supposed to talk to other people, just to their wives. But nobody would listen in. Well, strangely enough, one crewman told me he was talking with his wife. That was back in the Skylab days, 30 years ago. And his wife was saying she had been to the doctor, and the doctor had diagnosed one of the problems she had. And the medical doctor, who was a friend of hers, was standing next to her. And she said, well, maybe he will explain what the symptoms and diagnosis is. And she handed him the phone, and mysteriously the connection was cut off. So ground control realized that somebody else was on the line and not his wife, and it was not permitted. So they must have been listening. So if they tell you they don't listen and it's a private line, they're lying. So you can forget about the trust you can have with ground operations. They do listen in. You have to keep up with the timeline, as I was mentioning. You are constantly being watched, and you have to trust those on the ground whom you don't sometimes, and it's a problem. I remember one crewman said they had been trained with certain ground operators, and at the last minute they changed the operator, and they were there in space for 2 months with an operator they had never met. They didn't like the guy. They even went on strike one day and decided not to talk with him, and they didn't realize that they had forgotten to turn on the communication system. They had turned it off for some reason, and ground couldn't talk with him. And the ground control were terrified. They thought something had gone wrong with Skylab for 24 hours. The next day they came back on board and said, hello, everything's normal, but they had given him a punishment. They didn't know him, and they didn't like him. And that can be a problem. So the relationship you have to have a trusting relationship with those whom you are dependent on the ground. That's important. I won't go into that. Munze and Canis have suggested a number of areas of further research, which I've tried to, for each subject, posted a summary of what I got out of that book. And you can look at that summary. You have certain cognitive and perceptual motor skills. How do you retain them? How do you acquire new skills? How the impact on workload, on mental performance, onboard monitoring of automation. These are things that have to be researched. These, for every subject, I've included a list. I won't go into them because going into any of these would take a whole lecture. So I've just left them there as a list. You can look at it afterwards. And if you're very interested, I doubt if you'll have time to do so, you can look at that one reference book and read all about it. You have the psychosocial stresses. As I mentioned already, you have boredom, demoralization, isolation from the Earth, knowing you may not be able to come back, getting along with your fellow. These are the standard type of problems you could have on the ground, but they're exacerbated. You can't leave your group. You have multicultural differences. Just an example, I don't want to go into each of these, but during the NASA and Russian collaboration before the ISS, one crewman, he was an American, each crewman can take a certain amount of personal stuff with them, and they usually take some object like a book or some private thing that they really like, and they may take some food and that they really like. And the Russian took a certain kind of sausage, a special local sausage that his grandmother has made, and he wanted to eat it sometime during the mission. A great big preserved sausage. And after being on board for a month or so, he decided he would eat it. And being a nice guy, he decided to share it with his fellow Russian crewmen, and then they decided, well, maybe they should share it with the damned American on board. They didn't quite like him, but anyway, maybe to be polite. So they cut it in 3 instead of 2. I mean, it was a limited sausage. And they were eating it very delicately, and the American took it and finished it. And then they looked and said, "And? Did you like it?" I mean, that was for them. They had been waiting 2 months to have that, and they realized the next 4 months or 6 months they would have nothing more of that luxury. So they had really sacrificed some of their wonderful sausage for him. And he said, "Well, our hot dogs at home are much better, you know, and, well, I mean, I suppose one can eat it if one trains oneself to." I mean, this guy had difficulties for the rest of the mission. They didn't want to have anything more to do with him. There were other problems as well with this guy. I can't remember whether it was the same person, but I met one of them, and on the ground before flight, one of these NASA people who had not got any of this sensitivity training or group dynamics training. And I remember seeing him in Star City, and the person taking me around said, "Hey, that is the next American going up there." And I said, "Hey, hi," I forgot his name. "Smile and I'll take a picture." And I had my camera with me. And he put his hand in front of his face. He said, "Nothing doing, you know, you can stuff your camera," and walked away. He was a bit embarrassed later on when he was officially introduced to me, because I was one of the chief scientists on the mission. And he met me again and gulped. He thought I was a tourist at first. And he said, "Oh, well, I mean, I didn't quite realize you were a scientist on the mission." Well, I mean, one should behave oneself anyway. He didn't get along with the crew on board either. Psychology is important, and that kind of behavior is not acceptable. Unfortunately, there are lots of people who behave that way. I won't go into all of this. A lot of this is very obvious to you. Hygiene, housekeeping, responsibility taking, sleeping, eating. All of these things are problems on board. On the ground, they aren't. But you have a limited amount of food. You get your little tubes of soup or your tubes of cheese or your tubes of whatever else, and trying to declare these things are delicacies. They're not. And eating is a wonderful thing on the Earth. And when you lose that joy, and you've lost many other joys as well, it can be a bit stressful in space. You have preferred ways of doing things, a certain pace of working. You can't really. You have to work in the way your fellow crewmen work or the ground wants you to work. There are certain roles that maybe you are used to. You want to maybe save face if you're Japanese. It's much more important. than a Dutchman who says exactly what he thinks to your face, and you think he's being insulting, but he's being normal. That's the way they live every day. We don't see it that way. I live in Holland, and I feel myself insulted by the Dutch people every day. Apparently, they don't feel insulted by each other. Well, that's a different culture. There is a certain amount of competition. That's the same thing with you. If you come across very useful information, are you going to tell your fellow student who is competing with you on the grades, or your fellow co-worker who at a meeting will be able to say, hey, I read about this research which is very important. If you tell him, he might raise the point and get the brownie points at the meeting. Maybe you keep it to yourself. We have a certain amount of problems with that kind of thing, and this affects our everyday life. Are we better off sharing this information or not? We are. But how can we persuade ourselves that that is the case? We are stronger if we all help each other. If I help my colleague with what he's doing and he helps me with what I'm doing, we will save ourselves a hell of a lot of time. I may be researching into a subject that somebody else has already researched into and spend weeks or months. And if I can just talk to him over coffee and tell him what I'm doing, and he shares what he has done, we could be saving a lot of time for each of us if we all do it. Unfortunately, in most cases, in industry, in banks, in hospitals or whatever, one tends to want to keep information for oneself. Sharing, this is important. Of course, in space you have other things. Territorial. Well, if you have an office here, that's also a problem. Somebody puts their bag on your desk, or you have a part of a desk, and they don't respect that this is yours. This is your little area of the office, and that you really, that's the little part in the whole building that really belongs to you. And here somebody has been eating their sandwich and their crumbs and God knows what else on it, and maybe spilled some coffee on your chair while you were gone. You won't be very happy. In space you have very little space, so that's even a greater problem. I won't go into all of these things, but you have certain things go further. Once you begin to displace your anger if you can't talk about things. You can turn certain assumptions into facts. You get more fatigued. Your morale begins to go down. You begin to get more irritated if the problems are not dealt with adequately and in time. And this is true in space as it is on Earth. I don't want to sound religious, on Earth as it is in heaven, but it's roughly like that. We have different cultural norms. We have both positive and negative norms. We can blame others, we can complain. That's a very good thing. When you get around to drinking coffee at your typical workplace, well, let's see now, which professor can we talk about who's an awful person, or which division head can we talk about who is up to no good, and whom can we blame for the fact that we didn't get any certain work done. These are so-called negative norms. We can also encourage positive norms. You meet somebody, whether you like him or not, and you train yourself to say, what good characteristic does this person have that I noticed in this last week? Let me tell him that. Hey, you're wearing a nice tie today, or your presentation you made the other day was very good, even though you hate him. You'll be surprised that you begin to like the person you hated, because the person is so happy you've given him this compliment. He gives you a compliment back maybe, and you see he's not that bad a guy. Well, some of them are, but some of them aren't. So there are certain positive norms that one can develop, and it can be, they can be good for the group. But these don't come naturally. Somebody has to remind you and say, you can do that. Oh, yes, I hadn't thought about that. I didn't quite realize I was always talking negatively about somebody until the person joins the group, and we finally have to shut up because he joined. To develop positive norms is a difficult thing. It reduces part of the fun of all this talking and gossiping, etc. But there are good positive norms one can develop, but one needs a certain amount of training, a certain amount of awareness. A certain amount of group dynamics training makes you aware of the things you are doing. That's why I think it's extremely important for people, especially in your profession, to have certain amount of group dynamics training, which is rarely done. And this is probably the only exposure you will get to it in your professions. But a group dynamics training is not just simply listening to a lecture, but this will help. It's going through something more detailed, but you have to want it. All these problems you will have on the ground can be amplified in space, and I won't talk about this too much detail. You can read all about it. Sorry to go through these slides, but I don't want to go through the boring things. If you don't like my slipping through a slide too quickly, tell me and I'll go back to it. I just want to get on to the next topic so we can have some more discussion. I've just tried to be complete in some of these lists of things, but I've already talked about some of these things. These are the issues that one is being confronted in. I think you can just absorb it very quickly by looking at that slide, and you'll see that I've already talked about half of these things. So I will just go on again. And what symptoms? We see certain symptoms occurring. We begin to see the person is emotionally labile or hypersensitive, more exhausted, becomes depressive or withdrawn. Each person reacts differently. Now, if you know the people, your friends, your relatives, and you see certain symptoms, if you've known them long enough, you'll know something is wrong. Hey, what's wrong with you? You're being too polite today. Or you're being too withdrawn, or you're quieter than normal. Something is wrong. And you'll be able to identify it very quickly. We should be doing this in everyday life with our fellow team members, and in space that's what one should be doing. And by getting to know each other well, that's why we try to sometimes train the crew and keep them together, they will be able to notice such things. The ground communications may be able to notice it. For example, in communications in German or Russian, one tends to use the Sie or Du in German. Or in French it's the vous and the tu. And also in the Russian it's vous and tu, which is more formal than informal. And this sometimes shows when a crewman is using one or the other, something is wrong. In Russian you might call somebody by their first name or by their patronym, or there are certain ways of communicating, and if you notice that it has changed from the normal, then you may notice something is definitely wrong. And these are the things that one should watch. Certain symptoms you might see with different people are different. Something is wrong, and if you notice it, try to help your fellow man, whether on your team, whether you're a fellow student, whether you're a fellow doctor, or in space. We can do that. And it's good for us when somebody else does it for us, because we are wanting people to recognize sometimes and take that. We are sometimes crying out for help, but we're not doing it consciously. This third quarter thing, well, if somebody's in space 6 months, one notices that about the 4th month they have their lowest point. Or if they're in space for 12 months, it's about the 8th month. So this is a symptom that it's scientifically studied. You're kind of done half the mission behind you, still have roughly a little bit less than half in front of you, you're a bit down. Often the ground controllers will try to create something of interest for the crew so they won't get too discouraged and bored. There are other symptoms, insomnia, neurosis, etc., etc. Other consequences where you begin to become less compatible with your fellow crew if these problems are not dealt with. Your efficiency of work goes down. You begin to make more mistakes, which is very, very bad, and this could be dangerous for the mission especially. It could be dangerous for a medical doctor performing an operation. I just learned, I was staying with a medical doctor friend of mine, and he told me recently a surgeon had performed an operation of removing somebody's bad leg. Well, unfortunately, he removed the wrong one. Maybe he hadn't slept well. Maybe he had certain stress. Well, the poor person had to suffer with no legs afterwards. The same thing happened with, I know of another case where the doctor removed the wrong eye. I won't tell you other cases. One with the wrong kidney. These are terrible situations, but this happens when you're under stress. It may be that you make some errors, and in space you can make some critical error that can endanger the spaceship. But it's the same thing in your profession, in space. So a lot of these things you can carry over. You won't go flying into space. You took this course for fun, more or less. But you can apply a lot of these things in your everyday life. Group compatibility goes down. Cultural subgroupings take place. You begin to want to communicate with the people of your own culture instead of making the effort of trying to get along with the damn Russian who hardly speaks English. Scapegoating, blame somebody else, blame the ground, but it's very unhealthy. You don't recognize the leadership that was organized. You are there in space for a while, somebody else. There's a lot of things that can happen that are not very good, and if you don't recognize it, if you don't take enough action, and this can be the same groups, the same problems here on Earth. And these are some, I won't go into them because we will run out of time, suggestions for further research. You can look at this later. I will give you the copy of this PowerPoint. The Russians were fairly early on taking care of the psychological aspects. They had much more experience, and they realized it was extremely important, group compatibility. They tried to put a team together that got along. They did a lot of psychological testing to try to see whether people would work. They had even certain computer games, interactive games, things like that, to test to see how people got along. And they tried to put a team together they thought was compatible. And they were quite successful. That's why when they were working on missions, they tried to keep a team together once they had one. But still, despite their excellent work that they did, some 20% of the crew were still considered to be not compatible. What happened? Their tests were good, but with time it changed. It was not the same thing. After a few months in space, you were not the same person you were before. So you have problems. Some 30% were more or less, and some 40 to 50% were only described as being compatible. Sorry, 20% were not at all compatible. So it shows that simply putting the right people together is not enough. You have to sensitize and train the people to be able to continue keeping up their compatibility with each other. It doesn't just happen. It's not just passive, it's something active. They noticed differences, like weight loss if people were less compatible. They tended to work less effectively if they were not compatible. They communicated less with each other and with the ground. They made more errors. So there were problems, the real problems. It's not just simply a nice thing for people to be happy together. They work better. And it's the same thing in everyday life here on the ground too. If the team gets along and you work well together, then everything works better. So these are all the areas, and here again, recognizing, maybe I'll go into these very briefly, he suggests that one should try to research into these, both demographic and personality characteristics, values, attitudes, which could be help to take care of the symptoms and the problems that could occur later. And this is maybe not so critical for a couple of months in space, but it is very critical if you're going to have a space mission lasting maybe a lifetime. Essentially, recognizing certain predictable determinants. It means you recognize when somebody begins to twitch their left nostril, that means the person is annoyed or he's depressed. For somebody else, it means they start blinking one eye or start farting more often or whatever. There are certain things, and if we get to know our fellow team members, we will recognize these things, and maybe we will start taking action. Maybe it's not the time to confront somebody about a problem, but to about something they've done wrong, but maybe trying to help them and give them a positive stroke if something is going wrong. These are the things that we call. There's a certain amount of prophylactic action, recognizing symptoms, being prepared to take corrective action. So we go into the next one.